Have you ever felt it? That sudden prickling sensation on the back of your neck, the one that makes you stop what you're doing, mid-sentence, mid-step. It's a primal instinct, older than language, older than walls and windows, the chilling certainty that you are not alone, that somewhere, just beyond your line of sight, an eye is fixed upon you. Most of the time you turn and there's nothing there. You laugh it off. A draft, an overactive imagination. But what if one day you turned and you were right? These aren't campfire tales. These are accounts from people who felt that gaze, who looked into the darkness and saw the darkness looking back. People who discovered the terrifying truth that their safe space was a stage, and they were the unwilling star of a one-person show. Their stories begin where our deepest fears take root, in the places we call home. Story 1, The Observer Across the Alley. Our first story comes from a woman we'll call Clara. At 23, she was living the life so many of us know. The first apartment, the first taste of real independence. It was a small studio in Chicago, a shoebox on the top floor of a 3-story walk-up. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. And in a sprawling, anonymous city, that little box was her sanctuary. The only window in the apartment looked out over a narrow, unforgiving alley. Across that chasm of brick and concrete was another building, a mirror image of her own. During the day, the alley was a stripe of shadow. At night, it was a pit of absolute black. Clara worked late bartending. She'd get home in the dead of night, usually around 3 a.m., when the city was finally holding its breath. The routine was always the same. Kick off her shoes, flick on the light, and collapse. One night, about a month in, something broke the routine. As the overhead light flooded her small room, a flicker of movement caught her eye. ACR. Off the alley. In the window directly opposite hers, a curtain, just a twitch. She froze, her keys still in her hand. Her heart did a little drum solo against her ribs. She stared, waiting. Nothing. The window was a black, lifeless square. Just a draft, she told herself. Or maybe someone saw my light and I startled them. It was a logical, comforting thought. It was also wrong. The next night, it happened again. The click of her light switch was followed almost instantly by that same subtle shift in the fabric across the way. This time, she was faster. Her eyes locked onto it. It wasn't a twitch. It was a hand, a deliberate, slow hand, pulling the curtain back just a fraction of an inch before letting it fall back into place. The lights in that other apartment were never on. She'd always assumed it was empty. Now, she knew someone was in there, in the dark, waiting. This is where the psychological game began. The true horror wasn't just the watching, it was the insidious way it burrowed into her mind. She started to test it. Some nights she'd come home and sit in the pitch-black darkness of her own apartment, her phone off, not making a sound. She'd watch the window across the alley. For hours, it remained perfectly still. But the moment she turned on a light, even the dim glow of her phone screen, the curtain opposite would stir. Someone was watching for her. They knew her schedule. They were anticipating her. The feeling of safety in her own home evaporated. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a fishbowl. Every night became a silent, one-sided conversation with a shadow. She tried to rationalize it away. It's just a nosy neighbor. But that didn't explain the darkness. It didn't explain the perfect timing. It didn't explain the cold, calculated precision of it all. She asked her landlord. He was a portly, dismissive man who laughed it off. "The unit's vacant, kid. Been empty for months. You're just getting city spooked." He was supposed to be the one to provide security. Instead, he made her feel like she was crazy. "How do you report a feeling to the police?" "Officer, there's a ghost in an empty apartment who only moves a curtain when I turn on my lights." They'd think she was a lunatic, so she did nothing. She just lived with the mounting dread, the nightly ritual that was no longer hers. Then, one night, the watcher broke the rules of the game. She'd worked a late private event, getting home closer to 4 a.m., exhausted and mentally frayed. As she put her key in the lock, her fingers brushed against something, paper, wedged into the doorframe. Not a flyer, not junk mail. It was a small, crumpled piece of notebook paper. Unfolding it with trembling hands, she saw a single word, written in a shaky, childlike script. "Hey." The floor dropped out from under her. It wasn't just an eye in a window anymore. It was a presence. It had crossed the alley. It had been to her door. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She didn't even pack. She called a friend, her voice a choked sob, and fled into the night, leaving everything behind. The next day, she returned with the landlord, her fear now replaced by a cold, hard anger. She demanded he open the vacant apartment. He grumbled, but her intensity was undeniable. He fumbled with the keys and swung the door open. The air that hit them was stale, thick with the dust of forgotten years. The apartment was completely, utterly empty. Bare walls, naked floors that groaned under their weight. It was exactly as he'd said, vacant, until they reached the back room, the room with the window that faced hers. And there, positioned directly in the center, aimed perfectly at her apartment, was a single metal folding chair. A cold indentation was still visible in the thick layer of dust on the seat. Someone had been sitting there. For hours. For nights. For weeks. In a locked, supposedly empty apartment. The police were called. Fingerprints were taken. Nothing ever came of it. Clara moved out that week. But you don't just move away from something like that. It moves in with you. To this day, She doesn't know who it was, how they got a key, or what would have happened if they'd decided to write more than just, hey. Sometimes, a locked door is just an invitation, and the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that break them down, but the ones who already have the key. Story 2. The Man by the Shed. The fear of being watched in a city is one thing. You're surrounded by millions. It's the fear of the anonymous gaze. But what happens when you escape the city? When you surround yourself with miles of silent trees and sleeping fields, seeking peace and isolation? What happens when you realize you're not as isolated as you thought? This next story takes us to rural Oregon, to a family who moved onto a large plot of land swallowed by a dense pine forest. They had a son, 12 years old, and a golden retriever named Max. It was the dream. Quiet, peaceful, safe. But on their property sat a relic of the previous owners. A dilapidated detached shed about 100 feet from the back door. It was filled with rusty tools and junk, a project for another day. For now, it was just a feature of the landscape, a silent, weathered observer. The first sign that something was wrong came not from a human, but from the dog. One night, close to midnight, Max began barking uncontrollably. This wasn't his usual squirrel in a tree bark. This was a raw, guttural warning. The boy crept to his window. The motion sensor light by the back door had flicked on, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawn. Max was standing rigid, his fur on end, facing the shed, barking into the darkness. The boy saw nothing. Eventually, the dog quieted down. The next morning, however, they found them. Deep, heavy boot prints in the soft dirt between the house and the shed. They led to the shed, but not away. His dad shrugged it off. Probably just a hiker, son. Got lost. But Max knew better. Night after night, he would sound the alarm, always aimed at that same spot, and every morning, new footprints would be there. Then, one night, the boy woke to the crunch of gravel outside his window. He held his breath, every muscle tensed. The footsteps moved toward the back of the house. The motion light flicked on, and for a split second, frozen in the harsh white glare, he saw him. A tall, gaunt man in a dirty grey coat, his face lost in shadow. He was standing right beside the shed door, as if waiting to be let in. Then the light clicked off, plunging him back into darkness. He screamed for his parents. His father, a man who didn't scare easily, grabbed his rifle and ran outside. The man was gone, but the footprints were there, fresh and deep, leading right up to the shed's padlock. They reinforced the door, added a second, heavier lock. For a while, the nights were quiet again. The fear began to recede, and that's when the real tragedy struck. Max went missing. They searched for days. They called his name until their voices were hoarse. They combed the woods, knocked on the doors of distant neighbors. Nothing. The cheerful, loving heart of their family was just gone. The boy was devastated. That night, sleep was impossible. The silence of the house was heavier, emptier, without the dog's soft breathing. Around 3 a.m., a floorboard creaked in the hall. It was his father, already awake, holding his rifle. They stood together in the dark, a silent vigil. And then, the motion light by the back door blinked on. There he was, the man in the grey coat, standing by the shed again, bathed in that sterile light. But this time, he wasn't empty-handed. In one hand, he held a long, gleaming knife. In the other, he was dangling Max's collar. A sound of pure, primal rage ripped from the father's throat. He raised the rifle, but the man just turned without a word and melted back into the blackness of the trees. The police came. This time, they broke the locks and went inside the shed. What they found turned a story of a stalker into a full-blown nightmare. The floor had been cleared. In the dirt, someone had carved strange, disturbing symbols. In a corner was a small pile of animal bones, and behind a false panel in the wall, they found a backpack. Inside were wallets, watches, faded photographs of people they didn't know, trophies, and a notebook. Page after page was filled with jagged, insane, rambling and crude, terrifying drawings of houses, of families standing inside them, and all around them, dozens and dozens of crudely drawn eyes. He wasn't just watching them. He was a collector, and they were his latest acquisition. They packed their lives into boxes that very night. As the boy took one last look out his bedroom window, his gaze fell on the police tape fluttering on the shed door, and just beyond it, at the edge of the tree line, he saw a pale shape, a face, watching them leave. He screamed. His father, consumed by a grief and fury that no man should ever have to feel, ran outside, firing the rifle into the woods, screaming at a ghost he couldn't see. It was the sound of a family being chased from their own home, of a sanctuary being desecrated beyond repair. Some watchers don't just want to look, they want to take. Story 3. The Murmur in the Pines. Our final story explores the most terrifying possibility, that you can run, you can hide, you can go completely off the grid, and you might just be walking into someone else's territory. A group of 5 friends in their early 20s decided to unplug for a weekend, a camping trip deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. No cell signal, no roads, just them, their tents, and the ancient silence of the forest. They hiked for miles, found a perfect clearing by a lake, and set up camp. The first night was idyllic. Laughter, A crackling fire, stars so bright they felt like you could touch them. It was perfect freedom. The second night, the freedom began to feel like a trap. They were around the fire when one of them, Marcus, suddenly went rigid. "Did you guys see that?" he whispered, pointing towards the thick wall of trees. They all looked. Nothing. He swore he saw a figure, a silhouette, ducking behind a tree. They dismissed it. A deer. Nerves. 20 minutes later, a loud snap of a twig echoed from the same direction. The laughter died. The mood shifted instantly. The friendly darkness around them suddenly felt heavy, filled with unseen possibilities. They decided to call it a night, doused the fire, and retreated to the fragile safety of their tents. That night, one of the campers, the one who shared this story, woke up to a sound that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Breathing. It was right outside his tent, slow, labored, deliberate. It wasn't one of his friends. It sounded old, sickly. It moved, circling the tent slowly. He lay there, paralyzed, his heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He didn't dare make a sound. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The next morning they discovered they hadn't been imagining it. Around the campsite, circling all 3 tents, were footprints, but they weren't from hiking boots. In a patch of damp earth, one print was perfectly horrifyingly clear. It was from a bare human foot. Who walks barefoot in a forest at night? The question hung in the air, unanswered and terrifying. That night, they built the fire bigger, a beacon of defiance against the encroaching dark. They stayed close, armed with flashlights. Around 2 a.m., they heard it again, the crunching of leaves. But this time there was a voice, a low, guttural murmur, too quiet to be understood, but undeniably human. Marcus snapped his flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the tree line, and for a horrifying split second, the light caught him. Crouched deep behind a tree, like a predator, a man, staring at them, completely naked. He scrambled away the second the light hit him, disappearing into the woods like an animal. Panic erupted. They were miles from help, in the middle of the night, being stalked by something not quite human. They huddled together by the fire, too terrified to even go back to their tents. Hours passed. The fire dwindled to embers. In the suffocating silence just before dawn, a voice whispered from the darkness, clear as a bell, "I see you." And then he heard a sound right next to his head, the soft metallic rasp of a zipper. He looked at the door of his tent. The zipper tab was moving slowly downwards. A scream, raw and pure terror, tore from his lungs. It was an alarm that jolted the whole campsite awake. Screams answered his from the other tents. They heard a frantic crashing sound as the thing outside their camp took off into the woods. They didn't sleep. They waited for the sun. And the moment the first grey light touched the sky, they ran. They left the tents, the gear, everything. They just ran. At the ranger station, they told their story, gasping for breath. The ranger's face was grim. He nodded slowly. "We've had reports," he said. "A man, maybe more than one, living out there. Some say they steal things. Others say worse." They never found out what worse meant. They didn't want to. An apartment, a family home, the deep wilderness, 3 different places, 3 different lives, one unifying terror, the eye that watches from the shadows. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What really keeps us safe? A lock on a door, a wall of trees, or is our safety just a fragile agreement? A shared hope that tonight no one is looking, that the curtain across the way won't move, that the footsteps outside belong to a stray animal, that the zipper on your tent will stay right where you left it. The world is full of stories. Most are never told. They live in the quiet moments of fear, in the chilling memories of people who looked over their shoulder and saw their worst nightmare staring back. If you are drawn to these shadows, if you feel the need to understand what lurks just out of sight, you're in the right place. There are more whispers in the dark to listen to, more stories waiting to be unearthed. Consider this your invitation to lean in closer. You're not just a viewer here, you're part of the watch. Join us as we continue to pull back the curtain.